Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Human Biology, Chapter 18, the Respiratory System, Video C. And we left off at the regulation of respiration. So it is possible to voluntarily breathe faster or slower, and we know if it's voluntary that is our somatic central nervous system is involved. So if you want to breathe faster, like if you took 3 quick breaths right now, you could do that, and your thinking brain would be involved. But most of the time you don't think about respiration at all. So nearly all breathing is controlled by the autonomic central nervous system, which is involuntary. And the regulation of respiration is mostly controlled by what's called the respiratory control center, and that is found in your brainstem. And your nervous system will match the rate and magnitude of breathing to the heart rate and blood pressure. So this is really important, and it's really helpful so that when you need to be breathing faster and you need more oxygen, then your heart rate is going to be pumping faster so you can get the blood to the tissues more. So it's great how it's all coordinated. So how does your brain know when to speed up and when to slow down? So there's a chemical control, and this means you have chemoreceptors in your brainstem and arteries, and they monitor the levels of CO2 and pH in the blood. And we know when CO2 levels reach a certain point, that means that you are going to need to breathe. You're going to need to get rid of carbon dioxide, and you're going to need to get more oxygen. And when CO2 levels reach a certain point, the brain tells the diaphragm in the intercostal muscles to breathe. So this is your main trigger for breathing, is when your CO2 levels are detected by chemoreceptors in the brainstem and in arteries in your body, that CO2 levels have reached a certain point, and it's time for your diaphragm to contract and for you to take a breath. There's also mechanical control. So you have mechanoreceptors in the muscles and the joints, and they monitor when you are moving. And so when the movement increases, these receptors tell the brain to increase respiration, which works out really well because when you start moving, your cells are going to be more active, and they're going to need more oxygen, and they're going to need to get rid of their CO2. So there's a nice picture on page 414 that you should look at, and we will discuss during class. So respiratory disorders, what could possibly go wrong with the respiratory system? So one disorder is asthma, and this is a chronic disorder, and it's also called an obstructive lung disorder, and it affects the bronchi and the bronchioles, and it causes them to inflame. It causes inflammation of the bronchi and bronchioles. Also, it causes excessive mucus production in the bronchi and bronchioles. And thirdly, it causes spasm of the smooth muscles in the bronchial tubes. So what happens because of all this? This will all make breathing difficult or even impossible because of reduced airflow. So inflammation of the bronchi means that they will be getting smaller. The region where the airflow will get smaller. Excessive mucus production also makes the room for airflow smaller. And then if the smooth muscles are spasming, they're contracting, and that makes it even smaller still. So symptoms of asthma or an asthma attack include feeling suffocated, labored breathing, and wheezing. So the causes of asthma or a specific asthma attack will vary by each individual. Some common triggers are exercise, a respiratory infection, tobacco smoke, cold air, and allergies. Treatment. How would we treat asthma? So inhaled steroids to prevent inflammation are a very common treatment, as well as for an acute episode, inhaled bronchodilators. So those are going to dilate your bronchi and bronchioles, and that will open the airways during an asthma attack. So let's take a look at this. So we have our normal airway right here, and you can see that there is oxygen, easy flow of oxygen. In an asthmatic airway, we see that the bronchi are inflamed, and so they're a little bit smaller, and we have a little bit thicker mucus there, so that makes a constricted airway. And during an attack, these smooth muscles have constricted, and so it makes that airway a lot smaller, so it makes breathing quite a bit harder, and in some cases it can even close it off altogether. Another respiratory system disorder is pneumonia. And in pneumonia, this is actually not a specific disease, but it's a condition of the lungs. And when, for some reason, the alveoli in the lungs become inflamed and fill with liquids, that is when we say that a person has pneumonia. So what is the problem with this? Well, if your lungs are filled with liquid, it's hard to get the oxygen in there, and so this really interferes with gas exchange, and the body does not get enough oxygen, and it indeed becomes starved for oxygen. So what could cause this? It is caused by several bacteria, viruses, and occasionally fungi. And these microbes are around in the environment all the time, and they cause disease, usually when the immune system and or your lung function is compromised. So it could be compromised by respiratory illness. It could be compromised by a chronic disease like AIDS. It could be compromised by old age. And smoking is also another way that is common that compromises the immune system and especially lung function. So we talked about the bacteria and the viruses, and very occasionally the fungi that cause pneumonia, will cause problems when your immune system and or lung function is compromised. Could also cause pneumonia if you had a large dose of it. Perhaps if there was a lot of people in a concentrated area and some people had pneumonia, then that would be another way that a healthy adult could get pneumonia. Another thing to think about is diagnosing. How do we diagnose pneumonia? Well, usually doctors will listen to the lungs and they can hear the characteristic sounds of pneumonia. They may go a step further and have a chest x-ray, a sputum test where you actually cough up mucus from your lungs and then they look at that under a microscope, or there are blood tests for this. How does one treat pneumonia? Well, rest is a really big thing in being able to get better from pneumonia. Also, antibiotics. A lot of times doctors will prescribe antibiotics for pneumonia, as a lot of them are bacterial infections. And then cough medicine to suppress the cough. And pneumonia really wipes you out. You may feel tired for a month or more. So our third and final disorder we're going to talk about is bronchitis. And with bronchitis, again, this is not a specific disease. It is a condition of the lungs where the bronchi are inflamed, as we know from our medical terminology, itis, inflammation of the bronchi. Also, they are filled with mucus, which is expelled by coughing. There is a nice picture on page 419 of healthy versus bronchioles that are suffering from bronchitis. So in bronchitis, the mucus is thick and may be discolored. And the symptoms, again, a cough with mucus, so a persistent cough that lasts for several weeks, and the production of mucus or sputum. Other symptoms are fatigue, shortness of breath, a slight fever and chills, and chest discomfort. So how do we diagnose bronchitis? So it's usually diagnosed by listening to the lungs. Maybe the doctor will have a chest x-ray to rule out pneumonia, or a sputum test, again, to rule out pneumonia, or a pulmonary function test where they see like how hard you can breathe, what your lung function is. And how do we treat bronchitis? Again, just like pneumonia, rest is really important, and cough suppressants to get your cough under control. And you may be given anti-inflammatory medicine to kind of, because there's a lot of inflammation of the bronchi, to help with that, or steroids, which would help with the anti-inflammation. And that's similar to if someone has asthma, how they would treat that. And smoking is really hard and can cause bronchitis. So if somebody smokes or is around secondhand smoke, they should stop. And bronchitis is either going to be acute or chronic. Let's look at the difference between acute and chronic bronchitis. So acute bronchitis can develop from a cold or other respiratory infection that kind of hangs on, and your lungs become inflamed and filled with mucus, and there's a persistent cough. So after treatment, this usually will improve in 7 to 14 days, but your cough can linger for weeks. Whereas with chronic bronchitis, this is a constant inflammation of the bronchi, and one definition is you cough up mucus on most days for more than 3 months. And this is often due to smoking. So looking at chronic versus acute, this one, the best treatment is to stop smoking, and in this one, the best treatment is some rest and then whatever medicine the doctor prescribes. So let's look at the difference of some of these disorders. So we talked about pneumonia, and this is where your alveoli fill with liquid, with thick fluid, and that makes gas exchange difficult. You can see here the alveoli are filled up with fluid, and then it's going to make oxygen exchange hard, and your body doesn't get enough oxygen. Down here in bronchitis, the bronchi are inflamed, and they also have thick mucus, and so it's often due to an infection or an irritant like smoking if it's chronic versus acute, and then you have a cough that will bring up mucus from your lungs. And then asthma is our third disorder, and in this one, the airways are inflamed due to irritation or whatever triggers your asthma attack. And then during an acute episode, the bronchioles constrict due to that smooth muscle spasming, and it makes breathing very hard, if not impossible. And so you need a quick fix. You need one of those bronchodilators, which are the asthma, where people take a puff on their inhaler. A fourth one that we didn't talk about is emphysema, and this is where the alveoli burst and fuse, and this causes an enlarged airspace. And so since we know surface area is a big name of the game with gas exchange, when a lot of these little bags become one big bag, you lose a lot of surface area. And so you just can't get as much oxygen, and then the body is really in an oxygen debt. This one is more common with smoking. So now that we know so much more, we're going to check in Emily's asthma during class. So that ends our respiratory notes. Great job, everybody.